Nice. Hello, hello, hello. So, welcome to our making of presentation for DOGWALK. So, this is the Blender Studio's latest open project, and it's for once a game this time. So, it's this one, by the way. If you haven't played it, you can get it on Steam and on itch.io. It's for free, just like with all of the other short films that we've made. Today I will be presenting with these two wonderful people, with Andy Goralczyk, who was 3D artist at the project, and Simon Thommes, who did the technical, the pipeline TD work, and also development on the game itself. So plenty of hats. And me, Julien, Kaspar, I'm usually a 3D artist and character artist at the studio, and this time I got to actually direct and do programming, so that was a bit weird. Very different project, because usually we do this, like I hope most of you have seen these, but we did like 15 short films by now. But there was one exception, if some people remember, because DOGWALK is actually the second Blender Studio open game project. 16 years ago, there was Yo Frankie, which was basically a tie-in game for Big Bug Bunny. Made with the original Blender game engine, rest in peace. We've been playing with the idea of like, let's make another game, and so we thought we should finally give it another shot. So for 2025, we wanted to do things a bit differently. We were just going from one big project to the next, and for this year, we just wanted to do like very small, short-term projects, completely in-house with the team that we have. And so pitches came basically from anyone in the team. We just needed them to be short enough and have everyone involved. Turns out actually, like we like games. Like I like games a lot. Turns out like a lot of other people in the studio love games. We actually sometimes do game jams in the studio, usually for this little device, which is called a Playdate. So very humble, very little. But why do we even make a game? So. Vivian and I, we came up with the idea of DOGWALK, but the other people came up with very different ideas. Andy I hear uh-ohs in the crowd. Andy also came up with Singularity, which is the short film that's currently in production, which is continuing like the painterly style that we did in previous projects. Pablo Fournier didn't have to do lots of convincing to give us more cowboy, so that's also underway. And Rick Schrute also proposed a whole character rigging mini project that will end up in a new open source character rig, this time a kid for once. Because the producers, they couldn't say no to any of these projects, we actually accepted all of them, which will lead to, it did and is still leading to a pretty wild 2025 because it's a lot of work, totally doable, and will definitely not bleed into the next year. But before we actually pitched like a game, there was first the pitch of like a game in general, because we never made one before, at least the current studio, the current arrangement in the team. So early on, we thought of it more like, okay, let's call it the interactive project. And that was also kind of a bit of a strategic move to shift the focus to interactive storytelling, because usually we are way more strong in like 3D art, animation, and storytelling. And we didn't want to have a heavy focus on like a very fun gameplay loop, but what can we actually say with this thing? Also, games usually take a lot of time to make. So we wanted to basically reuse as much as possible, make this really short. I compared it to like, what if we like make it to the equivalent of like a 30-second short film? So maybe if we do it smart, we can get it to like 10 to 30 minutes of gameplay. Now in hindsight, I have no idea how that math worked out, but it's still a lot of work. So overall, like we tended to call it basically like a micro game. It's a much different scope than what you usually see. Somehow people trusted me with like helming the project, even though I have like very little experience before making games, but I nagged them for long enough over the years, so I think they just caved in. There was another really interesting point to this project, and that was like it offered us to collaborate with another open source project, which is Godot, especially, yeah. Especially since the Blender game engine wasn't really there anymore officially in Blender. This was just like a really good choice to go with, and I'm like a personal fan of the project, so it kind of makes sense. But there was one interesting point early on, and that is usually not a problem, and that is that we're the Blender studio. We use Blender, so we actually use it as much as possible. We like have a big focus on like trying to do as much of the pipeline with this tool, up to rendering, video editing, like everything. So there was like some thoughts of like, doesn't it actually look more like this when we release it? Which like there's nothing wrong with this. Like this is actually like the more common perception. If you make a game with a game engine, like that is what it is made in. It's actually the final stage, the thing that the game actually runs on. So with the game engine as the primary software, we thought, okay, let's try to use Blender as much as possible. So if we use like 51%, like 51% of the work is done in Blender, then it's all good, right? It also allows us to play to our strengths, since most of us have like did not even open Godot before. So, but to be honest, it actually looks more like this most of the time, like all of the time, because we're much more of an open source studio than a Blender studio. There's so many tools that we use in our daily work, from Krita, Inkscape, and GIMP for 2D art to all kinds of other open source software to fill in the blanks of everything that Blender cannot do. And of course, we run everything on Linux. We also usually get to pick some development targets. That is something that sometimes comes a bit in hindsight with open movies. But we thought, what are the new or existing features that we can stress test with Blender? Since we tried to do as much as possible in Blender, one obvious thing was the asset creation, animation, and level assembly. We do as much of that in Blender and see how compatible we can make it with the game engine. And then an obvious choice for that was the glTF format, the file format, for import and export, which is already like well supported on both Blender and Godot for models, animations, and pretty much anything. All of this already existed, so we were just able to go straight into prototyping, and it seemed like when all the pitches were happening, we had the most momentum, so we were supposed to go first. No pressure. Just to give you also a little bit of a brief of like what DOGWALK is about. So it's like a dog walking game where you actually play as the dog, a huge unstoppable dog with a tiny little kid in tow. The goal of the game is pretty simple. Like the kid wants to decorate the snowman with basically anything that you can find, some colorful trash in the environment. And this actually was just there as a vehicle for you to interact with the kid, to go out there and see what you can discover naturally, or maybe just run around everywhere and get the kid stuck on pretty much everything. The theme behind it was sort of playing together. We wanted to see like how much can we get out of like an extra character that you can indirectly control, and how it can feel and what it can tell about like responsibility, sharing a bit of control, and essentially a bit of a relationship building exercise in game. With another big topic was feasibility. This is like actually a very early prototype. And we wanted to center everything as much as possible on one mechanic. And that became the leash, where everything is working with that. The movement, the navigation of the environment, the interactions with the kid and the level, and all of the different challenges that we came up with that you can find in the world. They were all meant to work with the leash. That was good. That gave us a lot of focus on also making that work as well as possible and getting it out of the door, the game out of the door as fast as possible. This topic of feasibility also continued to the art style. So in the spirit of not spiraling things out of control, we had to come up with something that works, that we can get done in 4 months. So we came up with the idea right in the winter break. And this was the only artwork that we had for the pitch. And this didn't really inform the style. It was just sort of to give you the mood. And the only other thing that we had was the 2D sprites that you saw in the prototype that made it like a playable animatic. But the style was pretty unclear at this point. We just knew about some of the requirements. So it was really vital for everyone in the team to be able to contribute. Usually our projects are long enough and short films, so everyone has just automatically something to do. But with this one, it meant that it still had to be 3D, and there had to be plenty of animation involved, some technical topics with shading. And it shouldn't be overly grueling to work within 4 months. You can come up with a lot of stuff, but can you actually pull it off? So it had to really fit in the time frame. It also had to be compatible with Godot. So we can basically come up with anything in Blender. In the short films, we're trying to kind of push the engine to its limits and see what we can do. But in this case, we actually had to do a bit of the opposite approach and just go with how simple can we go, so that everything can be pulled off and relatively easily. Also, coding was way more of a topic this time, because usually we are all artists and animators. Some of the artists had to become developers, and that takes away time from the art. So it was primarily me, Simon, and also Max, who we got on board as a composer, and he was also developing. So trying to cover as much as possible there, to also save a bit of Simon's time, especially since he was also working on the pipeline and procedural art. Lots to do. I wanted to go over some of the inspirations and references, because one idea early on that we had was to really embrace the look of low poly. And 2 games that kind of came to mind for me were Jusant and Vane, because you can tell that they are completely like flat shaded or pretty much low poly. And it gives you a bit of leeway in like making the artwork a bit more glitchy or embracing intersections and really leaning into that. And that was, the idea was that really helps us with not being too perfectionistic. We also really like the art of Rex Crowley, who worked on Little Big Planet, Tearaway, and Knights and Bikes. He has like a really good focus on making the art very approachable to work on, and also kind of like scribbly while still really feeling the art direction and the iteration that went into it. And then also Don't Starve, which had like a similar, very similar feel to it. We also read a lot of picture books. We make, some of us make like a yearly pilgrimage to the Bologna Children's Book Fair, which is like just completely filled with wild traditional art creativity, everything that you can find. I can highly recommend it. It's fantastic. We were especially looking at some of the books from Mark Janssen, which has like a really nice collage style, very loose and very expressive. And eventually I stumbled upon the art of Kelly Poussette, which does like these papercraft winter sceneries. And I just really love the physical lighting of it and the minimalism in how things are created in this kind of craft. But with this, you can really tell, like, if you try to make this as a game, the devil is in the details, in the lighting, and in the fine texture. And there's also the endless art supply of Vivian Lukowski, our art director, which like is all in the art corner of the studio. And we did some experiments before, like previous projects also leaned way more into painting, actual traditional painting for the textures and for art direction. And we also did some experiments with actually like printing out UV sheets, UV maps, and just painting over them, and then using that directly as textures. At this point, this kind of just all goes into Vivian's brain, and this is what she calls the soup stage. Everything goes in, and then something comes out. And during the winter break, she made this tree. It was Christmas, and we all thought it was really lovely. There was much approval, and we just thought, yeah, let's just go with it. This is it. And then from here, I'm just going to give it over to Andy.
Okay, yeah, well, as Julien said, Vivian just single-handedly crafted the whole movie in paper. All we as artists, me and Bo Gerbrands, all we had to do is just take what she made and take the scans, snip them up, and make some models with it. So this was one of the early tests after those trees came up. I think in the first 2-3 weeks of the project, we're still trying to figure out things. So she made this test model of this bush. And well, we got the whole bush scanned. Actually, it was scanned twice, once in like just a full painted bush, and then after that we snipped it up and then scanned up the individual pieces to see how we can assemble them. And it was already pretty astounding at this point that if you have all these little elements, what kind of variations you can come up with, because yeah, you can actually do a lot with just a few pieces that you assemble together and put in different configurations. Yeah, that is the first kind of one of the first tests that we did, just an assembly in Blender with Eevee, of course, and some lighting thrown on, and then yeah, we had some bushes made and some bark textures, and yeah, Bo just made the whole environment by assembling these pieces together and come up with many variations of that. So that was very promising. We knew that all we had to do was give Vivian some time, and she would produce a whole lot of stuff that we could scan and assemble things with. At that point, it became very important to art direct it, because as Julien said, the project was very low poly inspired, but if he said the devil is in details, right? None of this stuff is really low poly, because if you look at it really close and you want to get that handcrafted look, you actually see these small little imperfections, these folds and things that don't quite line up. And then there's no intersections in paper in real life. So you need to account for that when you make things. So this was a process that had to become highly art-directed. Like, we got a lot of really helpful notes also to figure out how to do those folds and where to put a crease. And also the little discolorations that you get when folding paper. Also the little surface imperfections and the little roughness in the paper, and what the paint does once you put it on top of everything, like the little glossiness and everything. Super highly detailed. You can get really lost in that. But yeah, some models were also made purely by referencing 2D sketches. So, like, for example, some of the is it playing back? Okay. Some of the environment assets, like the shed and the bridges, some of the trees, were just purely made from sketches, and we got some scans of little bark texture, wood texture segments, and we slapped those on, did some painting and some careful assigning of certain attributes in geometry nodes, and yeah, we got it there fairly quickly. We also did some scattering, because we really wanted to build this whole environment, this whole paper craft sort of tableau. We needed to give it a lot of variety, and we also wanted to make sure that you can define each of the sections, that you can locate yourself in the world by looking at these different bushes, grasses, and that kind of stuff. So scattering, we did it all in Blender in the set assembly stage. We used geometry nodes, of course. One of the early problems was that, does it actually, it doesn't loop anymore. Can I loop this? Oh, the mouse is kind of stuck over there. Well, never mind. Well, the problem was that that we were working with the glTF export, and we had to make it aware of instancing in Blender. And once you apply the whole scattering in geometry nodes, the problem was that it just became one big mesh, and we had to make it aware to actually, if you apply it, to spit out these instances that we could reference then later in Godot. And thankfully, Simon and Jacques-Luc made some development in Blender that made that possible. And there was also a lot of procedural modeling done with geometry nodes. So some of the assets we had to keep fairly editable throughout the whole process. Like the pathways, and especially those little paper-torn deep snow sections. We had some early scans done that were based on these torn paper, bits of paper that were colored around the edges. And we found out that we, in order to get all the variety that we need in the environment, we needed to scan a lot of these, and then we would be locked off to a certain kind of shape and topology. So we also made those in geometry nodes based on a curve setup that just turns it into a meshed island with a little border around it that gives it a UV texture that you can offset and repeat around the edges, and then the paper texture would just kind of glue everything together. Then there was also more procedural modeling thanks to geometry nodes. The whole set assembly stage that Simon's going to talk about briefly later, it was fairly modular. We wanted to be able to change the set as we were going, and we were changing the game and prototyping it. So the little rivers were also done with geometry nodes, which is based on a curve that would generate some geometry that then would also calculate UVs that enabled us to project textures along the geometry. Characters. Well, these are my, well, I can't say that they're my favorite characters from the game, but they're really the most easy characters to make because they were already there. So at some point, Vivian sat down and she crafted those little birds, and all we had to do is just take the scan and then fold it back. Sorry. Same as the fish. So basically, those characters were done like over a couple of days. It was super easy. Those characters were not. The main characters, which the whole story was hinging on, took quite a while to make, because also the art style wasn't that. I mean, the art style was clear. It was papercraft, but how do you make these characters that you're supposed to identify with and that you follow throughout the whole game out of paper? There's a danger of them being too flat and not interactive enough. And so yeah, how do you make those characters? Are they just cutouts in this whole world? Are they dimensional? That was the whole question. Also, because as Julien mentioned, the whole production was supposed to be fairly lightweight. The rigs had to be fairly lightweight to be exported into Godot. After a while, we kind of settled on this sort of papier-mâché look, which made the characters not really a kind of a print out and then scan it back in process, but it became much more, you really had to direct it, sort of. And also that was way more evolved. So also the texturing was also more, more iterative rather than just scanning a whole thing and then replicating that in Blender. Yeah, speaking of the deformations that we had to do with importing it into Godot, there was also some early considerations to cut some of the budget, especially in the rigging process, but also in the animation, to make it, to limit the amount of facial deformations that we do. So one of the tricks that they came up with were these kind of sticker mouths, which was super fun and super charming, but for a big dog that moves a lot and has a lot of fur, that doesn't quite work if you just have a mouth that you kind of glue on. So that didn't quite work with some of the animators, and we had some concerns. So for the dog, we kind of changed that approach and made him more like this paper-torn, frayed edges kind of thing. Yes, this was what what we couldn't afford, but they absolutely wanted to have this lovable dog that's full of fur and really shaggy, and but we had some technology constraints where we couldn't actually do physics simulations in game, or we wanted to really worry about rigging all that and animating that. I mean, the animators would have kicked us probably. So in the end, we kind of found a middle ground in that. We still had to be able to translate this whole methodology into papercraft, and paper is not really that floppy. So it's more of this taking inspiration from stop motion animation and trying to make it kind of feel like it's handcrafted animation. And yeah, that also made the rigging not entirely easy, but way more achievable. Oh, speaking about animation, Julien, would you like to talk about it?
Right. Okay. I wanted to also give a bit of insight into this part, because so far the art style decisions mostly made sense. We found some difficulties. I didn't anticipate how difficult it would be to get this animation style to work, because we wanted to also we really wanted it to be animated on 2s, which basically means 12 FPS, because it's like using 24 FPS as the baseline. But how do you, well, it's also it's a tried and tested method of just making animation a bit faster to create. But it is very rare to see this in games, particularly because it is kind of contradicting the idea of going as high FPS as possible. Usually the games strive to be at a stable 60 FPS. But there were some corner points, some games that already do this, animating at a lower frame rate, and those are 2D games. So sometimes they even go lower, animating on 3s or 4s. And it still feels extremely responsive. You don't really notice any downside in this. So this is what we try to achieve, making sure that we step as much as the animation as possible, and we know what to interpolate to make it to give it as much real-time, instant feedback as possible. So yeah, let's just do that. How hard can it be? So the problem is, like, by default, it will look something like this. Like, you plug in the animations in the engine, and it's just gonna directly interpolate it very smoothly. There's an obvious clash in animation styles. So there was a lot of stuff to figure out with 2D animations. It's easy, like, you just hand draw it, it's going to look exactly how you drew it. But in this case, with 3D animations, you need to consider a lot of more things, like everything is based on armatures. There's blending of animations, or you compose multiple animations, you layer them. There's procedural animations. It gets complicated really quick. And there weren't really a lot of online resources available of people doing this before and sharing how they did it. So we just kind of had to figure it out ourselves. This is sort of pretty much close to the end result. It's a bit unpolished, but it's close to what we wanted. The trick really is to update as many visuals as possible, matching with the keyframes that the animators have placed. Good thing is, like, we had pretty much an even animation frame rate, so it was just purely animated on 2s. And basically, there's also some other tricks involved, like the character rotation. We limited how many angles they can actually go in, and that just really made sure that it is extra snappy and feels a bit more in line with the animation style. But yeah, there was a lot of extra effort for this sort of animation style. This is some of the some visuals that shows the theory behind it. Basically, instead of interpolating in a linear range, you try to snap the values to certain segments. But then you also need a little bit of a threshold so that it doesn't jitter when it's right at the cross sections between them. But then it also tended to get more complicated for especially character rotation, because based on the speed that the angular velocity, we changed the amount of possible rotations that the character can snap to, and that made it more it basically makes it a bit more close to the how fast the animation that was already created is updating. And on top of that, you try to update it not just when there's enough of a change in the rotations. You also just update it the moment the animation itself would also update. So there was basically a timer running in the background that would know when exactly a new keyframe would be hit, and that's also when you update the animation blending. It's when you update the rotations, and all of that was constantly running in the background. But we also try to do as little blending of animations as possible. So with this sort of animation style, you can get away with just instantly switching between animations, and it looks fine. Nobody will notice. But there were some difficulties with exporting the animations and then also importing them. Turns out the optimizations that Godot is doing for imported animations were done for linear interpolation. So animations would kind of get jumbled once they get into the engine. We reported that. It's all fixed now. That's fantastic. But it's the typical thing of as we're working on the project, it's a bit difficult to work with. And then for everyone who wants to do it afterwards, it's easier. So yay. There's a lot more that I wanted to write down. I documented as much as possible on an article on the studio website. You can check that out. There's also lots of code snippets that you can reuse. And hopefully this can be built upon more in the future, because I think it's quite useful. But enough about that. Actually, let's get back to the workflow of how we actually made the game. We talked a lot about the art style, but I think now it's time to talk about the pipeline.
Yes, enough of the artsy, cutesy stuff and how we made things look nice. Let's talk about pipeline. What Julien also said in the beginning, the art style was also in part benefiting how we could work as the Blender studio, where we are very familiar with working in Blender to make things look nice. But it needed to be compatible. So the idea was to really focus on a relatively simple pipeline as far as we could, to make sure that we can do most of the work in Blender and have the people that are familiar with working in Blender, the asset creation, the animation, keep all of that in Blender, and then try to choose our battles wisely in a way that we can actually import things very easily into Godot and things just work. Part of that worked very good from the beginning, others not so much, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But the general philosophy was very much try to use Blender as much as possible in the way that we know it. First of all, I'd talk a little bit about the world building aspect of this. So just to start from like a global level, we had the whole world map that was split into different parts just by area, so we could work on different parts of the world at the same time. And those were just all handled with different collections, potentially in different files and then linked together. But we would still have like a global overview of the world as it comes together, and then basically split the level based on like natural seams in the world. That was mainly like the lake and then the rivers that attached to it. And so all the individual parts of the world, the areas were individual sets. And each set was still split up further into different layers. And those layers mainly were made up by the different behaviors of the different parts. So there were, for example, like the trees were like one set layer, and then the ground was a set layer, and that was also in part about how do we want to use these different things in Godot to hook them up to how the game engine actually will interact with them, because like some parts are going to be passed through and just used as triggers in the world for when you're actually interacting with it. Others are actually visible, and the players will actually bounce against them and can't pass through them. Some things were specifically just for the game, like triggers for like different lighting changes, stuff like that, and those were all individual set layers, we called them. And that already gives a little bit of an idea of the kind of structure that we went for the pipeline, and that's also very much inspired with how we work in Blender. So usually when we work on our movie productions, we have a lot of nesting. So anything that we reuse in our shots is just an asset that we can just link into another Blender file, and that's just how we work. So we have sets, and that those might link in some specific assets, which might link in parts of an asset. And here, as an example, I just looked at like the world is like a forest, and it contains a lot of trees. Of course, not every tree is unique. We reuse them as much as we can. So there's a set of like 10 different trees, and they also reuse the branches that they're built off. So there's a lot of nesting of assets. And the idea was to recreate the structure that we have in Blender that we're familiar with, which is how we work all the time on our movie productions as well, and just recreate that in Godot as much as possible. And the concept for that was that we just create this concept of an asset, which each asset on the Blender side would be exported into its own glTF file, and then imported in Godot, have its own TSCN file, which is like the file format for a scene, which you can instance also in a nested way into each other. And that's actually where we could attach also game logic to an asset. And on the Blender side, that meant we had we had kind of a disconnect between what is a file and what is an asset. So assets were like the unit of a collection. Because with the collection exporters, I don't know how many people are familiar with this kind of workflow, but it's very convenient to be able to set up a collection export in Blender, where a collection will just export into one glTF file. So we had like, I'm going to show a bit more of that later, but we had like some environment files where we built all of the assets for the branches, for example, for specifically the birches. Those were just sitting in a collection. Each branch was its own collection itself, and set up for a collection export. So anytime we hit the export button, all of the branches would be written to their own glTF files. And then the same way that these branches then are instanced on the Blender side to make up the trees, we would recreate that on the Godot side. And that was very convenient to use, because then we could also like completely set up the file structure as we wanted to, and the collection export would always just work. And you don't need to like change the settings every time you want to do the export. It's just all set up already. Yeah, I'll have more information also on the blog post, but I'm going to talk a bit more about these kinds of concepts now. So what that means also with this kind of setup, what I already mentioned a little bit, is that we can attach the game logic to different, maybe I'll play this again, different entities on the Godot side. So each I'll just call it an entity right now in Godot that we would use in the world that we set up in Blender would have its own abstraction layer of this TSCN file, which we can add anything we want to. We can add some additional nodes for game logic in Godot, and it just references the glTF file, which we export from Blender directly. So whenever there's a change, whenever an artist pushes a change from Blender to any of the assets, Godot will recognize that there's a change on the file system, re-import everything, and everything's just hooked up. And the TSCN files are the thing that we actually write Godot data to. So that's where we attach the game logic. And then here I have an example of these reads, for example, where we just attached a script, which you can see in the middle here, to make this a tuplable entity. So it could topple over when you run over it. And that way we could really just reuse the same functionality, just throw that on all of the different assets that are supposed to be toppled over. And yeah, everything would be still hooked up to how we set everything up in Blender. So it was a super nice workflow where everything is like live linked together, just the same way that we know from Blender, where we actually commit very heavily to a linking workflow where everything is nested into each other. And yeah, the way that we did that, so here's a little bit of like an actual realistic use case where you can see I'm changing just all of the leaves on a tree, just rotating all of the branches, and then I just run the script to export the glTF files, and then in Godot it recognizes the change, picks everything up, and all the trees are different. So it's a very convenient workflow. It really worked very well. You don't even have to open a bunch of different files. You just change it in the one file that all the trees are set up, and yeah, they're still set up with the same instancing, so it's all reusing the data. It's not like applying it and then making every tree its own unique asset. Yeah, and that worked on every level. So if you remember in the beginning, I was talking about the structure of the world. I was talking about the different areas set as sets and set layers. And that nesting carries all the way through how we build the world. So a branch is an asset, a tree is an asset, the whole forest is an asset, the world is an asset, everything's an asset. And that was very useful for us to go for such a generic way of working, because then we could really yeah, nest everything together, and whenever we needed to add another abstraction layer that we can actually attach game logic to. And yeah, that we could do basically destructively in Godot without losing any of the interactivity by pushing data to on the glTF level. So yeah, that made it very convenient for the artist to really stick to working in Blender and then trust the pipeline that it would actually just recreate that exact same structure in Godot. And the core to making this work was basically creating it in this generic way where everything is just an asset, and then providing a global understanding between Blender and Godot which assets have which dependency with each other, and where to find them on the file system. So the way that it was done was by hooking up to the Blender internal, the Blender native exporting process with hooks. It's very easy to, I mean, if you have some programming experience, it's quite easy to create an extension for glTF to extend the functionality of the export with your own logic. So in this case, because we didn't want to re-export everything every time, like a tree shouldn't contain the data for the branches if the data for the branches is already somewhere else. So we really wanted to deduplicate everything as much as possible. So what the most basic thing that the script that we had did was on the export, instead of exporting all of the nested assets with the file, just replace them with a reference. So it's just an empty. It remembers the hash, just an identifier for the asset that it represents. That is written as metadata on this empty, but there's no additional data about geometry, materials, or anything written besides that. And then we had another extension on the Godot end for the import, using that same global understanding of what this asset is, where it sits on the file system, to recreate that dependency on the Godot side and actually use the correct TSCN file, which actually contains the game logic for that asset, to really recreate that structure. It's all based on hooks to just, in the right moment in the exporting process, get the data it needs to, replace it, and then set it back at the end of the exporting process so the artist doesn't need to know anything about it. It just works like magic. Another more concrete example for this is maybe to handle collision shapes, like something that's very specific for game logic, because this is partially a physics-based game. There needs to be some information for the game engine to use about how to collide with objects, because I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but if you actually just use the geometry of the actual asset, you get a lot of problems with performance and stability and everything. So usually it's better to just replace it with a primitive shape that's good enough to represent the shape. And we wanted to have a convenient workflow of the artists building the assets and setting up the collision shapes to just place primitives around, see exactly what they would look like in Godot already in Blender, and then have that just be part of the exporting process. And the way we built that on top of the pipeline that we already had at that point was pretty straightforward. What I did was just create a geometry node system that basically works the same way as the primitives in Godot work to give you a shape. Very simple, like you have a bunch of different options. You have a sphere, a box, a capsule, a cylinder, and those have just parameters to define the shape, and you can just change those as a geometry node system, see a preview of what that looks like, and those are the same parameters that Godot uses. So just like I said before, on the exporting process, all I need to actually know about these collision shapes is those parameters. I don't need to actually export the geometry itself. So same thing as with the references, I just replace the actual geometry of that cylinder with just some information about the parameters on the export. And then on the import, I read that back and replace it with the primitive on the Godot end. And that same way we basically approached any single thing that we wanted to automate in the export process was just setting up a hook to replace the data with something Godot can later understand to read it back on the import. Right, so same thing also basically for shaders. There was a long time, because I haven't really touched on this, but I think about halfway throughout the production, I was still working on the pipeline, which is not good. Ideally, you have the pipeline figured out before you actually want to start production. But something that I held off for the longest time, because I was just focusing on the more important set building aspects, was the material pipeline. And the great thing about this was that it just worked out of the box with glTF for 99%. Because we went for a PBR workflow, PBR art style. So that's also what I think Julien mentioned in the beginning. The art style was very much catering to making it as easy as possible for us to switch from Blender to Godot. For the longest time on the project, that was just, we're just using the built-in features of glTF, and it was good enough. But we did want to have like a little bit of extra fidelity in the shading, so we needed to do some custom things. Okay, I'm gonna speed it up a little bit. So we did the same thing. I wrote basically the same shader that we had in Godot that did some fancy stuff, more or less, as a node group on Blender, and then would write out the parameters that would be read back in Godot in the end. One of the fancier things we wanted to do, have some fake paper thickness to make it look more tangible. Like Julien said, the devil's in the details, something that really makes the world feel more like you can touch it as it's actually made from paper, is having some thickness on the paper, and modeling all of that would have been crazy. So there was a shader setup that would turn it into this, to have like a little bit of fake paper that you can see if you really look in the details. There were some things that didn't work super out of the box, or they were also just not familiar to us working in the game engine. This is like the first test where I threw just the glTF from the world, as Andy and Bo were building it in Blender, into Godot, trying to recreate the lighting with some nice like volumetrics and stuff, but it was looking great from the get-go. This is no additional pipeline. This is just all built-in functionality. But yeah, you needed to make some cuts to actually make it performant, because this wouldn't have run at the frame rate that we wanted, because we didn't really optimize stuff yet. And yeah, like I said, this pipeline was very catered to our specific workflow. We couldn't make it into like a generic tool that we can just give for people to download, but everything is documented in the blog post that I mentioned before. So yeah, now what actually came out of this? There's a bunch of like adjustments, fixes that just made it into the glTF export, for example, thanks to Julien, who's sitting over there, the glTF developer. Who is always super happy to jump immediately onto a problem that we had and fixed it like the same day, and added some features that hopefully other people can also benefit from. Some developments also for Blender, like Andy mentioned earlier. Jack implemented some wrappers for geometry nodes to make it easier to get the data from the instancing out of geometry nodes evaluation, and a bunch of Godot developers also happily jumped on the task of helping us out with some things. So that was really great to see that level of collaboration and excitement about the project. The Kronos group, who's developing the glTF file format, they're also pushing more and more, like smart people are working, not just us doing our own thing, on making these things more generic and applicable for any kind of pipeline. So that's also going on. Like some things that I mentioned here are also actively in development for a generic tool set. And just to see the result, let's look at some stats. Here's the Steam analytics. We have stayed last week, I think, like about 300,000 downloads, which is quite nice. And more importantly, people actually seem to like the game. It's overwhelmingly positive rating, with 98% positive ratings, like about 1,700 ratings also stayed last week. Make sure to play the game. I hope you like it too. And as much as it was more of a technical demo, as like all of our projects are kind of like trying to represent what you can do with Blender and trying to push the boundaries of the tech behind it, it's really nice to see, and it's really something we try to do a lot, is to create something that people will love as much as we love making it. So that's very rewarding. And like we've mentioned a bunch of times also throughout the talk, there's a whole section on our website about blog posts where we go in detail talking about all these things, trying to share with people all of the things that we went to and what we learned from the projects. So make sure to check that out. And there's more stuff coming, like we're working on a short film that's also mentioned before. So make sure to, if you're not already, support us with a membership at the studio platform and get all the goodies there. We're also going to be at the booth in the market right after this for 4 or 5 hours, something like that, I think. So yeah, meet us there, check out the game and other upcoming projects. And thank you very much.
just to wrap it up, so yes, the team is going to be at the booth in the market, but the DOGWALK team core will be only for a couple hours, then it will be more about other projects and other projects. It's going to be about Storm, the character, then it's going to be about Singularity and this short film. And I don't know if they mentioned it, but we have Max de Groen, who is the music composer and sound designer, who's with us today. If anyone's interested, he worked on DOGWALK, and he's going to work on other projects with the team at some point, probably. Thank you.